Welcome to the deep dive.
Glad to be here.
So today we're digging into a bunch of sources, all looking at the recent happenings between Armenia, Russia, and Azerbaijan. This is mid-2025 context.
Right. And on the surface, it really looked like things were shifting.
Exactly. You saw what seemed like a definite cooling between Russia and Azerbaijan.
Yeah.
And at the same time, publicly anyway, this real activation, maybe even a warming, between Armenia and Russia.
Yeah, lots of headlines pointing that way.
But the big question these sources push us towards is, are these changes real, like fundamental shifts in the region, or is it something else? That's what we're unpacking.
And that's where the sober analysis from the sources comes in, looking past the immediate gestures.
Okay, so let's start with that surface view. The Russia-Azerbaijan cooling, what signs did the sources flag there?
Well, there's this background tension kind of simmering since the AZO plane crash incident.
Right.
Then you had the suspension of the Rossotrednichestvo office, the Russian house in Baku. Officially, it was admin stuff. But it came after this big media push in Azerbaijan. So politically, it looked like a statement.
And the sources also mentioned irritation in Moscow over Baku's cooperation with Kiev. Humanitarian energy stuff.
Definitely. That seemed to rub Moscow the wrong way. Plus, Russian media getting annoyed about Azerbaijani officials talking up, mutual recognition of territorial integrity.
And the big visual Aliyev skipping the May 9th parade in Moscow.
Yeah, the official reason was scheduling conflicts, but it didn't go unnoticed in Russia. Some negative reactions, and then Azerbaijan blocked the Tsargrad website. Little jabs, almost.
Okay, so that's the cooling side. Meanwhile, on the Armenia-Russia front, the sources paint a picture of activation.
A very different picture, publicly. Lots of high-level contact in May and June.
Like Pashinyan going to Moscow for May 9th.
Right, and then Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov visiting Yerevan, followed by Federation Council Chair Matvienko, back-to-back almost.
And what was the public message during those visits?
The sources say the focus was all on joint economic stuff, integration to EAEU, and this big emphasis on common historical memory.
Trying to sound positive, like they were getting back on track.
Exactly. That was the surface impression.
But this is where our deep dive really starts, right? The sources argue these shifts are mostly temporary, event-driven.
Precisely. Not a fundamental strategic realignment. Not some totally new Russian approach to Armenia.
So let's take the Russia-Azerbaijan cooling. Why isn't it systemic, according to this analysis?
Because the core stuff hasn't changed. Despite the public signals, the strategic foundations, security cooperation, energy deals, transport corridors, they haven't been scrapped.
So Russia and Azerbaijan are still basically operating on the same strategic page.
That's what the sources suggest. Driven by shared interests, gas, oil transit, the North-South corridor logic, and, importantly, the Turkey factor. Their relationship helps both balance against the West, in a way.
And the sources make a pretty stark point here. Russia has basically ignored much bigger incidents involving Azerbaijan before.
Oh, absolutely. Like the helicopter shot down in 2020, or Azerbaijani forces killing Russian border guards in 2023. Compared to that, closing an office or blocking a website.
It seems minor league, demonstrative gestures, the sources call them.
Right. And these gestures, like the Russian house closure, are seen as part of a pattern. The Aliyev government puts pressure on various foreign groups, not just Russian ones. Western embassies, even the Red Cross, have faced issues.
So managed friction, not a real breakdown.
Temporary controlled conflict. That's the assessment in these sources, not a sign of fundamental incompatibility.
Okay, so if the Russia-Azerbaijan situation is more performance than pivot, what about the Armenia-Russia warming? The sources are skeptical about that, too.
Very skeptical. The analysis is that these high-level Russian visits and warm words weren't about genuine solidarity with Armenia or respecting its sovereignty.
What were they about?
Fundamentally about reestablishing or maybe reinforcing strategic control over Armenia.
Strategic control. How did that play out in the messages, according to the sources? What were the Russians actually saying?
The sources kind of break it down. You had these emotional appeals, lots of talk about the shared great patriotic war history, framing Armenia as this brotherly nation resisting evil Western influence. Using phrases like, we're together, we remember, we value.
Building that sense of obligation through shared memory.
Sort of. Creating an atmosphere for control based on emotion. Then foreign policy messages. hints about Armenia maybe joining BRICS or the SKO, but framed as something Russia sees value in.
Implying Moscow sets the boundaries for Yerevan's foreign policy, like stay away from the EU.
That's the suggested subtext. Then economically, it's all about Russia being the indispensable partner, main trader, investor, guarantor of energy, food security. The EAU is pitched as this guarantee of stable development.
Making dependence sound like a good thing, a safe bet.
Exactly. Undermining the idea that Armenia could find viable alternatives. And finally, security. Constantly bringing up the Russian military base, the joint border guards.
Reinforcing the idea that Armenia can't go it alone, needs the older brother.
Precisely. So, according to this analysis, all these messages wrapped in seemingly warm gestures are just tools. Tools to manage Armenia.
Manipulating history, economics, security fears.
Yeah. The underlying message, the sources argue, hasn't really changed, even if it's less blunt now. It's still sort of, you're either with us, weakened but safe, or you're against us, and well. The warmth is just the current tactic to define and limit Armenia's actual sovereignty.
Okay, let's connect this back to you, the listener. What's the main thing to take away from this deep dive into the sources?
I think the biggest point is that, despite all the noise and the public posturing, the fundamental strategic relationships haven't really shifted. What we saw were likely temporary adjustments, not a sea change.
And the sources mention Armenia being caught in an indirect signal field. What's that about?
It means Russian actions or in statements directed at Armenia are often really intended for other audiences, maybe Turkey, maybe the West. Yerevan is just the medium for the message sometimes.
So why should you care about all this?
Because, as the sources really emphasize, it's dangerous to confuse temporary rhetoric, friendly or unfriendly, with deep, lasting changes in how countries relate to each other. You have to look past the gestures.
Stay sober, as the sources put it. Don't get carried away by the performance.
Exactly. The deep dive suggests nothing fundamental has altered. Just the presentation. For now, anyway.
Which leaves us with a pretty stark thought drawn from these sources. For a country like Armenia navigating these big power dynamics, does it always come down to this choice? Either remain a piece in someone else's game, subject to their signals?
Or strive for genuine sovereignty even when that path looks incredibly hard and the options seem, well, limited.
A tough calculation.
Definitely something to think about.
That wraps up our deep dive for today.